Okay, and we're back May 15th. This is our second to last discussion talking about the Uranus-Neptune cycle and a little bit more than that. But we were in our prelude, Nathan was just talking about the axial alignment of the, what would you call it, the 500s BC that Tarnas talks about in this chapter, where Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto all came into a triple conjunction, and just how consequential that period was. Nathan, did you want to say a little more about that before we just sort of like go back to looking at just Uranus and Neptune?
Well, my comment on your post was just that it's a 4,000 year occurrence. The three planets showing up together in the same area of the sky, and we're basically halfway through that cycle. Uranus and Pluto make like 170 year cycle, and Pluto and Neptune and Uranus and Neptune have their own cycles, of course. Right. And those are much shorter cycles, but the incident of the three of them really is one way of marking the really long epochs of time. Because there's only been one incident where those three planets showed up back in 577 BC. Historians do point to that point in time as pivotal for the difference between ancient societies and modern societies, because there was a great move away from polytheism and a move towards, it didn't immediately happen, obviously. It took 500 more years before Christianity emerged, and then more years after that for Islam to develop. And in between those 500 years, Judaism also emerged as a monotheistic sort of religion. And there were others, Zoroastrianism is a good example. But they've all basically led towards building the modern mind. And so it's very important point in time, and it's interesting that we're able to point to a very specific alignment in the sky that sort of elaborates what was happening at that time, basically a convergence of authoritarianism, of the Promethean sort of impulse for freedom, and the sort of disillusionment or the imagination of Neptune. And you can also point to other sort of principles that represent religion and philosophy and ideas. Jupiter would be very crucial if you were looking at it as an astrologer. But also Saturn is very important too, as we've been sort of studying with this book. So it's a fascinating point in time, and it's great that he included that, even though it was a very short chapter. He included that to sort of illustrate that everything since then has been kind of a development on that moment in time.
Largely so, or in the religious sense, especially. You mentioned the time of Christ then coincides with a opposition of Uranus and Neptune, the first one of the Common Era. Muhammad becomes prophet of this new religion of Islam in the 620s during a conjunction again of Uranus and Neptune. But these moments are so rare in time. But in the axial age, which I think broadly some people will say, well, they'll say there isn't really an axial age, or they'll say it lasts hundreds of years. Nevertheless, there does seem to be a convergence of pretty amazing phenomena around this period of the I don't know how you track, how you speak of, is it the 6th century? The 500s BC,
Yeah.
from the 590s to the
Oh,
550s,
Yeah,
when broadly speaking, these 3 planets were all within about 20 degrees of perfect alignment. And it takes so long for them to all mesh together in their cycles that it's an extraordinary convergence when it does happen. And yeah, Tarnas talks about it. It's given maybe 10 pages or less, but quite an array of kind of phenomenal occurrences happen to coincide with that. And we're still, in a way, living in that world that was born at that time. The birth of sort of drama and tragedy in Greek theater. The birth of Pythagoras is believed to happen around the 570s. The flourishing of Confucius and Lao Tzu, and potentially Zoroaster, we don't know exactly. Sappho, the poet. The flourishing of the Eleusis mystery cult at that time, and on and on. But a very important time, clearly. Okay, well, should we back up and then just focus back on Uranus, Neptune?
Sure.
Is there anything that people are wanting to start talking about with that? Because that in itself gets, what about like 80 pages of treatment in this chapter?
Are you saying, do we want to talk more about the triple conjunction?
Well, I'm saying maybe moving now to just the Uranus-Neptune pair as they come into their opposition, conjunction, and squares over time.
Right, yeah, sounds good.
Did you have certain things that you're noting, Kyle, either from reading this or that you've already noted about
Well, I'm trying to recover that.
Okay. Well, Uranus-Neptune times are notoriously ambiguous. It's particularly difficult to pinpoint or pin down why they are so consequential. I think even the 90s, I was sort of a kid or an adolescent in the 90s, but I think I had a hard time recognizing how revolutionary they were in some ways, but certainly looking back on it and then reading Tarnas's comparison of the 90s to the 60s is really helpful for me, and just seeing just how much the ground shifted under the culture at that time. It wasn't like the 60s with its political revolutions and its obvious a form of societal change, but it was more of a shift in consciousness, a shift in the way we relate. Even today, we're sort of dealing with the aftermath on this virtual way that we're talking to each other through the internet, through this virtual disembodied form. This all really took off and it exploded in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah. That was going to be my comment, that I mean, the web really didn't start until 91. And, you know, so personally, I mean, that was a huge shift for me that you know, lasted several years. And I don't know, I mean, in a way it never ended because it just keeps going, right? But the thing that started accelerating was the web, and that's when it happened. So
I remember I was living in Green Bay at the time, and I was so excited. I got my first computer with this ginormous monitor. Remember how big and heavy they used to be? And on TV all the time, I forget who it was, Peter Jennings or one of those, Tom Brokaw maybe, he kept talking about dot-coms, and I don't know what he was talking about. Like, what's the dot-com, you know?
Yeah.
And then they sort of rose and fell pretty quickly too. But it's just accelerated so much. And I think Kyle is right, it's just ongoing.
Yeah, there's some funny videos. You can look at like archival clips of news shows from like, yeah, that period where it was very strange and new. No one kind of knew, or not many people knew, unless they were in the know. They didn't really know what was coming.
Right.
It was a revolution, but it was hard to like, it wasn't like 1,000 people marching in the streets revolution. It was a much different
Right.
revolution.
Yeah.
I was always interested in the sort of promotion that happened because I remember seeing a movie back when I was very young, still in high school, about computers. And this was basically about the time that Apple came out with their Mac. It was maybe even just a few years before, but they were talking about personal computers and how at some point everybody would have one in their home. And I was always just sort of fascinated by that. You know, they talked about personal digital assistants, or PDAs, which are basically now what cell phones are. You know, we carry them around in our pockets, and it's a whole computer that used to take up a whole room, but now it's fits in our pocket. But yeah, I entered college basically right before the internet happened. So I was aware of news groups and things like, oh, I'm drawing a blank now. There were basically forums that you would dial up to and connect with. And, you know, you could meet people on the other side of the world, very much like the internet, but it was all done through, you know, interfaces that were very crude and not well developed. And that all changed with the internet very quickly. But it took, you know, a good 10 years or so before it got to a sophistication where everybody started doing it, you know. So even back in the 80s, you know, there were science fiction fans that I knew about that would get together on news groups, forums, and talk about stuff, you know, that they were interested in. And that was basically sort of grew out of a lot of what was previously just very exclusive to scientists and political, you know, the NASA, you know, governmental organizations basically did the very early forms of what became the internet. So they were communicating between computers, but usually at colleges and government organizations where they could afford the infrastructure. My first memories of computers are when I was very, very young at UC Berkeley. My parents were going to school and they both took a computer programming class where, you know, they had the IBM cards that you had to punch out on a typewriter sort of thing and then feed them into the computer. And it was nothing like the 80s when home computing happened, you know, initially, where you had to learn a language first. You know, everything before that was all done machine language, and you had to take a college class to really learn it. But by the time I got into high school, they actually offered computer program classes. It was always hard to get into. You had to be like a really A+ student to get into the classes, but you know, they were available even up in northern Idaho where I grew up. So
there was in 69.
Yeah.
69 was the year that the kind of ubiquitous programming language called C was actually first invented at Stanford or Berkeley, I don't know, one or the other. So I thought that was kind of an interesting, you know, Uranus-Pluto connection to the Uranus-Neptune thing that happened, you know, 20, 30, 24 years later. And then
I was actually,
yeah,
sorry.
Jupiter must have been in there too, because it was, 24 years apart.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah, Jupiter was there in the 69 period, and there was Tarnas talks about Douglas Engelhart. Is that his name? The computer
Yeah, well,
engineer who
that
gives
was certainly one of them, yeah.
they call it like the mother of all demos on everything that's going to come in computer technology, from the mouse to
Right.
for text and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
And then Tim Berners-Lee in '89 is, I think, the one credited with sort of bringing forward the internet. Again, Jupiter back in alignment with Uranus and Neptune. So Jupiter joins Uranus Pluto for this period in '69, and then it joins Uranus Neptune in this remarkable period of '89-'90. I don't know if you've all read up through the part where Turnus talks about all the revolutions, but there are social political revolutions that of course happened. It wasn't just the web, but these political revolutions also occurred, principally at like the crest of this wave of with Jupiter joining the alignment in Eastern Europe, and of course the fall of the Soviet Union, end of apartheid.
Right.
Were you going to say something, Kitty?
Off, Kitty. Sorry.
I was just going to jump in and say, actually, I was a computer operator years ago in an old IBM Honeywell. I think it was a Honeywell 3000, and it was a huge machine that took up a whole room with all the disk drives, the big heavy disk drives. And I started out as a key puncher. Yeah, it was IBM cards, and they were very noisy. Everything was very heavy mechanics,
Yeah.
and you could hear them going chunk, 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 chunk as they punched out a piece of a little square out of the cards. And then we also had key tape. So within 20, 30 years, when I went back to school, there were, PCs and cell phones, and
Yeah.
it's just amazing.
I think one of the most notable shifts in the technological realm, but others that probably, because it's hard to define these archetypal energies, but how like the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of the 60s climaxed a certain, like there was a certain physicality to, and just like the technological aspects, what were the breakthroughs at that time, and like you're saying, Kitty, how you punched cards, and we all dealt with,
Yeah.
computers were massive, and there was a conspicuousness to a lot of the technological breakthroughs, like the space flights with the enormous jet propulsion. And then with the Uranus-Neptune conjunction, what seemed to be happening a lot in the technological realm, but in other realms in different ways, is this kind of dissolving of like the physical, and a loss of like not even knowing how to like fix something because there's no physical thing anymore to touch. And this happens in a lot of crafts. I mean, I can think of even my craft of film projection, which started to go the way of digital in the late '90s, around the turn of the century.
Yeah.
And what was always a very physical craft, and still is in some places where I work, but has also become a craft where you don't know, you can't exactly say like where something's located unless you're brilliantly computer savvy, because there's no physical thing to touch anymore. There's no, so I think this Neptune dissolving of the physical is such an interesting thing. It has so much to do with, I think, disembodiedness and intangible quality that can't be touched, and it's difficult to describe.
I like that. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I've noted, like with the Neptune Uranus cycle, which is a bit hard to say what exactly is the most central thing about it. In the past, it seemed to relate so much to spirituality and the breakthroughs of new religions, as Tarnas documents. But in more recent times, although that's a big thing that he talks about in the late 20th century with the conjunction, there's also all these ambiguous ways in which it comes through. It's not just spirituality, it's many other ways in which almost a dissolving of the physical is one thing, or a dissolving of boundaries seems to be another, and ways in which different things that were previously separate are united, whether in a real good way or in a overly idealistic way. And this seemed to happen in so many ways in the 90s, including in Europe with the effort to form the Eurozone and all have a shared currency and sort of thinking that we can get past these national boundaries that had been so problematic. They seem to be trying to really move in this direction in the 90s, and then here we are after Uranus Pluto came back into square, and there's been a lot of move back toward nativism and Brexit and declaring what the boundaries are very strongly, both empowering nations, but also forming more clear divisions again.
Mm.
Yeah, that's sort of,
Rambling on this cycle, which has so much that's fascinating about it.
yeah, definitely.
It seems like there should be some, there should be some psychedelic connection here.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, because of these two planets,
Oh,
right?
definitely, yeah.
I'm trying to figure out how that timeline works.
Oh, there's a lot of stuff.
Because it's not obvious that the early 90s were exactly a heyday of, you know, psychedelic research or whatever.
Yeah.
He does talk about psychology and how things, he compares the 60s to the 90s and you know, towards the end of the chapter. And he definitely points out how there was more of a psychedelic sort of bent back in the 60s, but what the 90s represented more was just even more dissolving of those, the sort of boundaries that people were working on and a merging of those same ideas into new ways of relating. Let's see, what he talked about meditation sort of becoming a therapeutic thing rather than just being a societal sort of interest, and how it was being applied to psychology. But it definitely sort of follows what you were talking about, Tim, where there was both dissolving and merging of different sort of practices and ideas, at least within psychology.
When I was looking at your list of highlights of the chapter, Tim,
Yeah.
for some reason, the two books that came to mind, and this was during the early to mid 70s, and I think they were really influential, was the Tao of Physics and also the Dancing Woolly Masters. And those both were like a convergence, I thought, of the science, physics, and spirituality, and how they're just two sides of the same coin in a way.
I'm not familiar with the books. Did you say it's from the early to mid 70s or the 90s?
Yeah, early like 72, 74, maybe. I think it was Capra. Capra was, I forgot his first name. He wrote the Tao of Physics, and then it was about the same period, or maybe he was later. Gary Zukov had this sensation. He had a couple of really bestsellers, but the first one I think was the Dancing Woolly Masters. Oh no, wait, yeah. It was actually very good. It was very interesting. And that really sort of shook things up. I thought that's for me, because I'm not anywhere near being a physicist, but I was interested in enough, especially from the spirituality angle, because everything was relating at that time. That's the way things were really. And now it seems to have just grown into the whole, talking about fractals now and dark energy and, the new things that physics is just advancing so quickly. And now with the James Webb Telescope, it's pretty amazing.
Right, quantum mechanics and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, another book that probably was more focused on the science of it is Gödel, Escher, Bach. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that particular book, but it focused more on the connection between spirituality and physics.
Okay.
And it's a good book to sort of seek out. It's real more focused on the science though.
Okay, what is it called again?
Gödel, Escher, Bach. I can't remember the
sure.
Like Kurt Gödel, MC Escher, and Johannes Sebastian Bach.
Yeah, it sounds
Yeah,
like,
that
yeah,
was a-
Something
was
like
a
that,
big
yeah.
one.
I have it right here.
yeah,
Yeah, I remember that one.
okay.
I wonder what MC
So-
Escher's natal chart is. Looks like.
I
Probably-
I have a
found,
t-shirt with,
They must have all these like things you can look at it and it look
Yeah,
different
I
ways.
just, I found an interesting,
There we go. It's
Oh.
backwards.
oh, okay.
Douglas Hofstadter was the writer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And
so there's kind of a relevant find here that, so I was looking for references to Uranus, Neptune, Pluto cycles. And so there's this one thing on this GaiaMind.org
Hmm.
that has a table. It has a chronology of Uranus, Neptune aspects with the sign with with the signs included, if that's something that people are interested in. But it's I don't know. Is that worth passing along? I could just give you a
GaiaMind.org. I'll write it down.
Gaia, yeah. Let me I can put it on the chat.
Oh, thank you.
I can try to put it on the chat.
Someone's got birds in their background. It's nice.
oh, that's me. I don't know how to turn off.
No, I like it. I'm in a
Yeah, it
project.
stopped raining, so the birds are out.
Okay.
Oh. Well, anyway, it's GaiaMind.org. So no, you can't, actually, you can't go there with just GaiaMind.org.
hmm.
There, I finally managed to copy that line of text. Hmm.
Um, is there any specific parts of the chapter that people have read up through that we want to talk about? This one's not so political as previous chapters, but does have a lot. Kyle, in the beginning, you were talking before we started recording, I think, about romanticism. It does get into that quite a bit. Romanticism. You were saying, yeah, with the conjunction, was it, of the 18 teens and 20s, the last conjunction prior to the late 20th century, coinciding with Shelley and Keats,
Yeah, the romantic.
Coleridge and late Beethoven and Hegel's and his and many others.
This is my favorite, one of my favorite periods to study, really, especially around, because I was interested in art history and my art background.
Yeah.
The art world in Paris and London, and it was just, you know, so exciting, such a dynamic period, it seems.
Yeah.
And then there was the spiritualism movement, and
Well,
you know,
one thing to tie in art with, like, how do we do? I just think it's hard to define Uranus Neptune in some ways, because it seems to be an internal psychic type of alignment. But it seems also have to do a lot to do with like vision, things that we see, and then how we project what we see out there. But this period of the Romantic era of that 18 teens to 20s also coincides, as Tarnas talks about, with the birth of photography.
Yep.
And then the next alignment, the opposition, coincides really with the birth of cinema. Also, Neptune is in that alignment, Pluto is in that alignment as well, making it extra potent. Television comes in, and then in the next square, well, it kind of explodes in the next square in the middle 20th century. And then the internet arrives and explodes at the following conjunction. Just to cite the most recent ones, but it's been remarkable how these periods seem to bring us a new way of seeing the world, new ways that images can kind of flood back to us. As Tarnas talks about, it can be very problematic too, all of these different types of forms of imagery, because they're so hypnotizing and can lead us into just kind of mindless escapism, mesmerism. But in the more profound way, yes, like some of the most beautiful art during the Romantic peak that Kitty was talking about is really amazing.
There was a lot of changes during that period too, from regular representation like in the Romantic artists, and then really the way that people saw did start to change. I think I completely forgot what it was called, but it had to do with the light. During the industrial age, people would actually leave the city because it was filthy dirty and you couldn't see, it was full of soot, and they would go out in the country to get healthy, and then they started painting outdoors. So their experience of the light had changed as well. And then it also evolved into, different artists experimenting with things like pointillism, which was really just dots, like pixels. And I think in Italy, they started Futurism. That's where the whole Cubist movement sort of started too, with Picasso, how you really started perceiving the human form differently. And the light had a lot to do with that too. Flattening of the space, it was no longer three-dimensional.
And photography.
Right.
Yeah, photography had a lot to contribute to things like Futurism, because it was a mechanical process.
Right.
And so artists were trying to stretch that. Man Ray, who is seen more as a surrealist, is known for his photography, but he created a whole process for creating images on photographic paper. I forget the name of it that he called, but he basically started laying objects on plates, on photographic plates, and created images that way.
I'm thinking even of like Edward Muybridge in this, what was it? The square between the Romantic period and the birth of cinema.
Right.
Opposition. So in the square, Muybridge did a lot of his like single frame kind of breakthroughs where you would see like a horse in motion.
Right.
And it gave us, this was pre-moving pictures, but you gave us some of the first sense of like what motion is like. And it seems to anticipate Cubism on the one hand, like nude descending a staircase seems like a kind of Muybridge.
Right.
Duchamp.
Yeah. But also, I think what Kyle's getting at too is that it gave us such a realistic image of the world that it sort of covered what previously painting was striving towards. It was like, well, you can't be more realistic than a photo. So I think that sort of was one way in which painting had to either, you could continue to try to do that, or you could try to go in another abstract, new direction, experimenting more with like what the medium can do. And I think that contributed to a lot of the abstract nature of art in the 20th century that just got more and more abstract in many ways. Photography, you just like lock down representational imagery in a certain way. And so
Impressionism initiated that a lot, as that was, I think that was the movement you were trying to remember.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
But that goes back to British painters in the really early 19th century, where they were doing these very dramatic scenes that had, areas of darkness and areas of, really darkness, and then really bright areas as well. Usually landscapes. Kitty, you probably know the artists to reference for that period, but it comes from a much earlier painter, Caravaggio, who did chiaroscuro, which was usually scenes where people, there's one or two figures, and there's a really bright light source that casts lots of shadow. And so, you can draw a line from the Renaissance all the way up to Impressionism, of the late 19th century and into the 20th century, as far as that goes.
Yeah. And the whole photography thing too, one of the areas that really used to amaze me was daguerreotypes.
Yeah.
Because it really, to me, they look so crystal clear. It was almost more like a hologram. It was just amazing to me. It was so realistic. Have real sharp edged images and just beautiful. They almost look three-dimensional sometimes, really.
What was the word for that you used?
It's a daguerreotype. I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but
yeah,
yeah.
It was an early photographic process on a glass plate, basically.
Right. Yeah. I just had one thought about there's one section in here where the word numinous comes up a lot, right? I mean, there's a section where he just talks about the phenomena of numinosity, and so to me, one thing that I see that strikes me about just visual, representations that have become popular is seems like an attempt to just make everything glow, to have a numinous quality that is merely, colorful. I mean, it's an interesting thing. It's can you really make something numinous that way? No, not really. But you can try.
Yeah, Instagram.
Filters, yes.
I think they do that in advertising for cosmetics a lot.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's all illusion.
Back in the early 80s, I was in high school and studying animation, and Don Bluth had come out with the Secret of Nim, if you're familiar with that movie. And there's a special effect in it where I believe he managed to underlight things. It's a combination of underlighting and overlighting, but he managed to create a lot of numinous qualities in that particular movie. If you watch it at all, it's one of my favorite movies from that time period. But there's always these little sparkles of light floating around the screen that just have a quality about them that I always wanted to figure out how he did that. It's one of those things that I imagine it's probably pretty simple if you think about it, but I never could figure it out.
I think I've seen it, but is it puppets? You say it must be actually photograph animation, right?
Yeah, it was just standard cell animation.
Cell animation. So they had to draw the little points of light.
Right. Yeah, but it was somehow they must have, I'm thinking that they must have used either reflective paint or something, because when you look, I mean, those areas on the screen really glow and nothing else does. So it's interesting. Another good example that I remember is Dragon's Lair, the video game that Don Bluth produced. That was off of a video disc, you know, and it didn't work very well, but you can still, I mean, they still produce it. You can get copies of it to play on your home computer, but it was all done, you know, 2D animation, all drawn out and everything. But you see a lot of that effect where anything that's gold will, or, you know, and it has a glitter to it, it really sort of glows. And I don't remember seeing that in any Disney movie per se. I mean, a lot of the sparkles and things that Disney did had a flatness to it. And by the 80s, you know, Don Bluth had figured out a way to make that stuff visually glow on the screen. And it might have even been, you know, a photographic process processing the film afterwards, but I don't really know. I haven't been able to research it very well.
It's a big secret.
It's probably an open secret. It's probably an industry secret sort of thing. But
yeah.
I was trying to become a film nerd myself back then, and never did quite break into the industry.
I'm just distracted for a moment because I'm starting a digital movie. But I heard what you're saying.
Tim, can I ask how your event went with for the dinner with Andre?
Oh, yeah.
I was just curious.
Yeah, I think it went well. It was very good attendance. That was, yeah, at a theater where I'm actually running 4 screens, so I couldn't give it my full attention. That was another digital thing. But he was there. It was his birthday. He's still like pretty frisky and like funny. He's 88.
Wow.
That's a great
And the
movie.
movie is interesting. It's made by his now wife, who's like much younger, like 20 years, maybe younger, at least. And I think it's about them meeting and then flashing back to like Andre's development, his issues with his family, how his family impacted him. I guess he was someone who was like of a generation, and he was especially this way where like he said he was like never held or never touched or cared for. And then he sort of like pushed himself in a very opposite direction with his life, being super an explorer of the mind and spirit and body. I didn't actually get to talk to him. I didn't try to, but I imagine he stayed later and talked with a lot of attendees. Kitty, did you watch the movie, My Dinner with Andre?
I did. I
Oh.
loved it. It was
Yeah.
great.
I
Yeah.
even own the movie. It's one of the few movies that I have on my shelf.
Quite an amazing,
Yeah.
what a bold concept, just to have the concept and the
Yeah.
daring to make a film that's just going to be 2 guys talking.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was so engaging though. It really almost felt like you were at the dinner table with them.
Exactly.
And, yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to be distracted again for like 20 seconds. Sorry.
Well, there's just so much. I mean, this chapter has so much in it that it just melts my brain, you know.
Yeah.
I mean,
You said it.
it's
If you
it exceeds my capacity to take it all in.
Yeah.
Right.
If you could devote your whole week or 2 weeks or a whole month to just that,
I think
you know,
so.
and nothing else, with no other distractions,
And
you know.
there are just like single sentences, I feel, that you can sort of like meditate on for a day.
Oh yeah.
He just drops insight after insight on
Yeah.
ways that I think most people have never thought about the recent past.
Yeah.
New context for so much of what's transpired.
It's also good to see how he sort of talks about developments and even just recent developments. I kept on thinking about how young kids who might encounter his book and read about things that they probably didn't grow up with, but to have it sort of capsulized into these little nuggets of information, and then sort of projected onto this background of the different archetypes is, I think his book is probably going to take on its own life at some point.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think also for one thing he talks about in the late 80s and 90s during this conjunction is the rise of maybe seeing everything as kind of postmodern, free-floating, influx, epistemologically uncertain and confused, both more secular and more spiritual at the same time, but unable to reconcile them. And all of these confusing tendencies. And I think without this perspective, it's really difficult to be a person functioning well in a healthy way in the world, because the world is a very confusing place. There's many more temptations and things drawing one's attention, sucking one's brain in different directions, and more so than 50 years ago, 60 years ago.
Right.
And I just think this is such an invaluable way to understand how we've got to where we are.
Yeah.
He mentions all these problematic aspects of Uranus Neptune, like becoming ahistorical, decontextualized to the point of kind of like not knowing the ground that we're standing on, being obsessed with maybe a superficial form of imagery.
Right.
Or it's a really, it doesn't have the explosive violence and cathartic charge of like the Uranus Pluto and Saturn Pluto cycles that he looks at, but it's still one that carries its own really shadow side.
Yeah, a good example is when he talks about MTV.
Yep. It seems so tame now. I mean, thinking back on that seems so innocent compared to,
Yeah.
I mean, where we are, I don't know, some things are just so much worse. The temptations today.
I just remember every week, a different person would say something about a video that they saw on MTV that just was wacko, and I mean, now we see it a lot as memes on the internet, but back then, the MTV, and if you had cable, you got to see every single new video that came out usually was going to be playing at some point during the week. And oftentimes, you'd hear about it before you actually got a chance to see it. And yes, some of the stuff was really kind of strange. And, it's all now available on the internet now. It's kind of crazy because, what I remember as being quintessential to one media stream is now available, on multiple levels, apparently.
Right.
Yeah. One thing, I'm distracted again for a second. Okay, sorry. Coming to mind with MTV that I find sort of has like an irony to it is around 92, I think, is when The Real World debuted. So you have, on the one hand, it was the peak of the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. On the other hand, there was a Saturn-Pluto square coming in. I don't know, I feel like it's like this weird compromise formation where like reality TV comes in at this time when we're ostensibly becoming more real about like how we're, I don't know, engaging. But it's of course all virtual, and it's increasingly a fake and fraudulent real world. Even that Real World on MTV became more and more like, curated and very phony in some ways, and you're also dealing with it in a virtual way where it's actually not the real world. And reality TV, one problematic aspect that emerged, deep fakes, sort of ways in which archival things can be like manipulated through intersplicing of other imagery, and the the anonymity and what that provides for
Mm.
people in a virtual space, all of these problematic things and many, many, many more, Tarnas also alludes to as being really kind of exploding in this period of the early 90s.
Right.
When you kind of didn't have to be yourself in the same way that you maybe previously always had to be yourself in some way, or accountable.
Hmm.
It's kind of a ramble, but the real
I
world
was, I
seems
was
like
telling
a
Tim,
moment where like we shifted to a kind of different way of having a virtual world.
right,
Some friends and I were also trying to figure out when it shifted TV shows, when they went from being really delusional, like Father Knows Best, right? And The Perfect World, to the sitcoms started getting real sarcastic humor, and people were digging mean little digs, but they were under the guise of humor. So it was really kind of vicious, and the language started to change. And then I said, and then there was Jerry Springer and Geraldo Rivera, where people were literally fighting, and they were baiting people there. It was all entertainment,
Mhm.
you know, and everything just seemed to get real ugly from there. A little too much
Social
reality.
gladiator.
Pardon?
Yeah. Social gladiators.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
But we've come to the more just like inferior sides of the cycle. But what do people think about the more superior sides to the cycle, or sublime sides?
Hmm.
I think. What about, does anybody a Ren and Stimpy fan?
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. Why not?
didn't Ren and Stimpy come out like in the mid-90s or maybe the early 90s?
Early, yeah.
Early 90s, right? Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yep. There's a whole movement in the 80s and into the 90s of more and more like cartoon and cartoons became
Yeah,
cartoons, virtual reality,
yeah, everything
cinematic,
became,
Beavis and Butthead.
computer effects. In many ways transplanted what was again more of a traditional structure where we had human beings acting in front of a camera, and whatever happened, whatever we saw on screen was what actually happened in front of that camera. More and more it became like artificial backgrounds. The Simpsons was another, it could be cited as another huge breakthrough and turning point in '89 when that premiered. Ren and Stimpy, yep. I'm not an expert on these shows, but certainly I know that they changed the landscape of what was happening in television.
Yeah, and what was acceptable, because Ren and Stimpy really was different on a very visceral level. The sort of gross out humor was being projected visually, whereas before it was more the realm of stand-up comedians, and private clubs, nightlife and adults. It was distinctly adults, and Ren and Stimpy sort of merged a lot of different aspects of those things and presented it not necessarily for kids, because I don't think it was ever intended for children, but it was filtered through that idea that cartoons are meant for kids, so they have to have a certain safeness about them. So yeah, Ren and Stimpy was a real interesting turning point, and I think it was a development from the MTV generation, sort of growing up and trying their own hand at doing those visual things that they saw on all the videos that they had grown up with, basically. Yeah, there was definitely an explosion at that time of animators and people doing visual things differently. On digital computers definitely were by the late 80s, they were becoming more of a artistic, falling into the hands of artistic people who wanted to really stretch the medium more. So there was definitely a shift there and a maturing, I would have to say. The 90s definitely represented a time when media itself matured beyond the very programmed ideas of the 50s and 60s, the thing is, Kitty, when you were talking about sitcoms, I was remembering Archie Bunker was one of the first sitcoms that actively dealt with social issues. And it was interesting because Archie Bunker was so abrasive back in the 70s to like my parents and other people who considered themselves to be, good, patriotic citizens, Christians even, and Archie
That
Bunker
was revolutionary.
It was, and it I think it had a very positive effect because, before Archie Bunker, there were shows like Mary Tyler Moore and Newhart,
Right.
but they always played it safe, But as soon as Archie Bunker came on the scene, a lot of those shows started developing, a social conscience. And it really sort of changed the landscape of what Americans were consuming. So, it's interesting to watch that progression from the 70s through the 80s and then into the 90s, and how much, the internet has totally changed, even, really made things explode even more. One of the fields that I've followed, because working in bookstores before, is just publishing. And publishing is so much different now than it was even just 10 years ago, But, back in the aughts, we saw a lot of these self-publication. I'm trying to remember, Amazon put out a big business where you could have your book published, and that really changed the field for a lot of people. I'm sorry, I'm getting off onto a tangent.
No, that's good.
Lost my track.
Archie Bunker, I think that's true. Archie Bunker was really reflecting what was happening in the culture at the time,
right,
in the country. And I forgot the name of the director. Was it Sheldon Leonard or
Rob Reiner?
they were? Who was it?
Of the All in the Family? Is it Rob Reiner?
No, I'm thinking of the producer director.
The
was
character, I mean,
the producer director. I can't remember his name, but he was brave enough to do that, and that's where people really started.
Norman Lear, that's who it is, right?
Yeah,
That's right,
thank you,
yeah.
Norman Lear. Yeah.
And then there was MASH. You can't leave out MASH from that.
Oh, of course. But MASH started on Broadway and converted to television.
Oh.
So, a lot of the rawness and anger that, it represented was first presented on a stage. And so it was easy for them to bring it to television. But certainly Archie Bunker sort of paved the way for MASH to continue, because I think MASH came onto the scene before Archie Bunker, but it certainly had so many seasons, and it was largely because they were able to deal with more, increasingly more and more social issues that hit a chord for the American public.
MASH was a Robert Altman film. Was it also performed as theater? Or is that what you meant, the Altman film?
No, it originally was a play on Broadway.
Oh, okay.
And then the film was made, and then the television program.
Oh, well, okay.
Those eras too, people still came home from work, had dinner, the family gathered around and watched favorite TV shows. Everybody would talk about it the next day at school or at work. Did you see this show or that show or Seinfeld? And now, because of the internet as well and technology, You've got people, kids on their phones, parents on their phones. You can watch TV in one room and TV in another room, and you can watch TV while you're driving. You can stream everything where you go. So
So does
it's
that mean
the
that
whole structure has changed.
you can't go to the office and say, hey, did you see that? Because there's just too many things to see. And
Right.
no two people have seen the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of those TV shows, because there were fewer of them, they really brought people together, no matter what your favorite was.
Right, right.
And now we're all off on our own.
Well, they've still got that, right? They still got Dancing with the Stars, and
It's true. The Bucks, the Milwaukee Bucks,
The Bucks are playing right now, aren't they? We should probably stop this.
they
Zoom call.
probably are.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
over actually. Game 7.
Yeah.
Oh, let's keep talking. Yeah, Tarnas talks about this sense of in the 90s how suddenly, like with cell phones, nothing compared to what they are today, but the early cell phones that there's the beginning of this sense of people could be even in the same room and not in the same room, or
Mhm.
you're both more porously open to the other person. He talks about how people would be having conversations and then you could be eavesdropping on conversations with other people talking to people that were in another country, for example. Now it's more the form of texting, I know, for most people. And it's, I think, gotten pretty bad currently where it is today with people can be out on dates together or hanging out with their family or loved ones and looking at their phones. And I think it's
Yeah, I've gotten fond of
too bad. What?
just dictating my texts, right?
Yeah.
And it's actually more efficient than actually talking on the phone to somebody in a way.
Yeah.
Because you get to, well, I don't know. Somehow there's an indirection there that gives you a boundary
Yeah.
that somehow, anyway, I never used to be able to do that before.
Right.
I was thinking also about the dark side of Neptune. And because I've always been interested in spy stories and undercover CIA types of things and stuff. And there's so much of that has gone on in the past that we didn't know about and we're learning about, as things get revealed. I even watched the International Spy Museum on YouTube once in a while, but they have really amazing speakers. And it extends to fake news and the fog of war and just the whole, and while Mercury's retrograde and Neptune is in there, it just gets crazy. You really don't know what to believe,
That
Yeah,
would
it's
be
that
the
dissolving.
downside. Yeah.
Yeah.
dissolving. Yeah.
Society's boundaries have dissolved because of technology, and Neptune is definitely the sort of harbinger of that. As what it's going through Pisces right now, I think.
I think that was a conjunction. Yeah.
Yeah, it's getting ready to hit
Yeah.
a bunch of my personal planets in Pisces. So
No.
Maybe that could tie us back to I posted today, I don't know if everyone saw it, but just about my personal transits of Uranus and Neptune.
right, yeah.
And then I looked at Kitty's. She shared her birth chart with me, and I noted some things in her timeline where Neptune and Uranus were in aspect. Either Kitty or Nathan or Kyle, do any of you have accounts of your personal Uranus Neptune transits when have you looked back and noted those times being important for your own shifts of consciousness or dissolving of what were previous modes of understanding or being? Or did
I have to confess, I avoid looking at too many transits in the past because you can really spend a lot of time doing that. And Neptune and Uranus both have been planets that sort of make me cringe, I guess, on a certain level. But I can definitely say Pluto is one of the planets that have, I can use as a marker in my life.
The transit of Pluto or the transits to Pluto or both?
Both. I mean, I was going to talk, when I initially started reading the chapter, I was thinking, oh, gee, I really should talk about how Pluto in, maybe it's, I'm drawing a blank now. But I guess it was Pluto in Sagittarius was that period from the middle of the 90s right up to the turn of the century. And then after, I think it switched over into Capricorn, where it is now.
You want me to pull up an image to look at it or no?
I'm not sure. I didn't quite complete my whole thought
Okay.
because I got involved in reading the chapter, and but the idea I was going to put forth is that period from the middle of the 90s to especially because last week there was some talk about the generational shift from conservative, from more liberal thinking to a more conservative thinking, especially in politics. It sort of corresponds with that movement of Pluto from Sagittarius into Capricorn, which, we're talking about the difference between Jupiter and Saturn. So Jupiter is all about expansion, governments, definitely, and religion and tradition. But then Saturn is about structure and constriction. And it, you can make a direct connection between, the Sagittarian period being more expansive and liberal, and the Capricorn period being much more conservative. And that was basically my point.
It's kind of a mixed bag because Pluto went into Capricorn very close to the time when Lehman Brothers went down, right, in 2008, I believe. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I was right.
It was very much connected with the crash,
Right,
that fall, and I could not help but just shudder when I noticed that. That, oh boy, what are we in for? But one thing I remember from Pluto in Sagittarius was just the rise of evangelical, absolutism and extremism.
and I think part of that is, to tie it back into Neptune, part of that is Neptune's sort of transit, because Neptune is a much faster planet compared to Pluto and has moved through both Capricorn and Aquarius, and it's now into Pisces. And Uranus is even faster than that, because Uranus is now into Taurus. So, you could say that some of the variances of those time periods are more due to Uranus's need for liberation and Neptune's need for sort of breaking down boundaries and removing some of the things that were holding back certain forces. You can talk about it in a lot of different ways, so it's easy to get confused.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to have to go.
Okay.
I am too, actually.
Okay. So I guess we're concluding it. Well, before we do, the next and final chapter is pretty brief. So is there a consensus that we'll make it 1 week and we'll get together next Sunday for the final hurrah?
I'm good. That would be good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the 22nd.
Yep.
That'll be Sunday.
pretty brisk chapter, and
Are we doing one after that for the notes?
oh, for the notes, it wasn't
The
meant.
footnotes? I mean, it's a whole section in itself.
It is a lot of footnotes. No, but we could always have informal chats whenever.
Right.
So don't hesitate to, like, if you want to do an informal chat, we can do it. I was just thinking one more, and yeah. So next Sunday.
Great.
No, thanks. I've enjoyed this.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
this is
And
always
thanks for your
lively.
help.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for your help with those charts, Tim.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'd like to know what you think of them.
Yeah, when I haven't had a chance to really look at them yet, but thank you.
Okay.
See you next week.
Bye.
See you next week.
Bye.